Well, thank you very much. This is, all I can say is, wow. It's very exciting to see this many people here tonight, but quite frankly, I expected to see a crowd like that, like this, especially for an event this important. Before we get started, just a few announcements. I want to thank everybody for coming. I realize there's also another event taking place today, which is the beginning of the World Series, and my beloved New York Yankees, the best team that money can buy. Ooh, do we have some Philly fans out there? Anybody who's been to a Philly game knows the city of brotherly love is an oxymoron. But nevertheless, I'm looking forward to a heck of a series. So welcome to everybody. Just a few announcements before I introduce Dr. Mike Schuette and then, of course, our guest. It's kind of amazing to me how far the World Affairs Council has come, particularly when you realize that there are 3 staff people. Myself, Bob Seidenschwartz, the chairman for the council, Ambassador Mark Johnson, who is in Iran as we speak, meeting with Mr. Ahmadinejad. Mark actually had to stay over an extra 2 weeks, not because of any problems he had, ladies and gentlemen, just that the other tour group did not have its sponsor, so Mark decided to stay another 2 weeks, so Mark will be back. But Mark would be so impressed to see this turnout tonight. And then I cannot say enough about our executive director, Aubrey Lyons. This event has taken months to put together to bring this type of forum to you. Along with Aubrey, we have a dedicated staff of interns who, without their help and assistance, this is simply not possible. To all the people who have given their time, their dedication, our hosts, Pat and Kitty Robbins, who hosted a reception at their house prior to this, our many, many thanks. I'd like to just recognize Amy Ryan, if she's here. Please, a big hand for Amy and the assistance that she's given us. Doris Armstrong. And Montana James. These are some of the interns that have helped us put this program together. I would also like to thank very much our sponsors, for without their assistance, we could not do this. The council, folks, is not a big organization, as I just indicated, but our reach is extensive. We work on a very small budget. Your assistance in whatever way and form you can help, whether it's through membership or donations, we have to make this request because it's that ability to bring the resources in that allow us to bring the world-class people that you're about to hear here tonight. So I'd like to thank our sponsors, U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy, Jessica Rowe, who came out with Dahlia, is here tonight. And I cannot say enough about the fact that I think Dahlia said she was up at 4 o'clock this morning. And Jessica, did you get a little bit of an extra sleep? Yeah, so Jessica had to come, I think, from Iowa vis-a-vis Minneapolis. So, but 4 this morning, so she has been traveling. She is leaving early tomorrow morning. So even before she arrives, I'd like to give her a big thank you for just the time of getting up and getting out to Montana. I'd like to thank the Gallup organization. They made it possible for Jessica and Dahlia to be here. First Interstate Bank, thank you very much. Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, the international programs at the University of Montana and the Central and Southwest Asian program directed by Mirdad Kia, our friends at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and again, Pat and Kitty for hosting the reception at the house. I'd also like to recognize, and if they would please stand up, because this is what epitomizes the council and what we do. Would the students from Troy please stand up? What is significant about this is, I hope whether you're a Montanan by birth or have moved here in the last several years, you know where Troy, Montana is. Is it about 3.5 hours drive? And that's if the weather's good? These students drove down. They formed an international club in Troy. And an event of this type was so important to them that they took their time and they drove all the way down to attend this. And I'd like to thank Kelly Hughes, Milo Dragovich, who is a board member, who is putting up the Troy students at her house to be able to accommodate this visit. So I think when you start thinking about what is a council, what do we do, I don't think it's said any better than our students and some of the people that accompanied them from Troy to be here tonight. So folks, we've had a very vibrant, very interesting program. I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Schuette at this time, who will introduce our guest. Again, thank you for coming. It just kind of blows me away to see everybody here. Thank you, folks.
Good evening, everybody. Our special guest tonight is Miss Dalia Mogahed. And because we have filled the house, she gets to go back to Washington, D.C. and tell our colleagues she spoke for a sellout. And that's really cool. Dalia earned her master's degree in business administration with an emphasis in strategy from the Joseph H. Katz Graduate School of Business at the University of Pittsburgh. She's a current member of the Crisis in the Middle East Task Force of the Brookings Institute. She is a member of the Women International Security. She is serving on the leadership group of the Project on U.S. Engagement with the global Muslim community and is the senior analyst and executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. She is co-author of the book, Who Speaks for Islam? Islam as a religion is central to the lives of over 1 billion people. This population lives in 57 countries, but a majority of the world's Muslims live in Asia and Africa, not in the Arab world. In fact, only 1 in 5 of the world's Muslims are Arabs. When one looks to the global Islamic community, a quotation by pre-Civil War American writer Henry David Thoreau is appropriate. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. Miss Dalia Mogahed's book, Who Speaks for Islam, offers us essential insights, clarifying our view of issues concerning democracy, theocracy, extremism, jihad, women's rights, and Muslims' relations with the West. These essential insights are based on a Gallup World Poll. It is the largest study of its kind. So let's give a warm Montana welcome to Ms. Dalia Mogahed.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And it is such an honor to be here. This town is amazing. I actually grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, which reminds me a lot of Missoula. It's a university town of about 100,000 people. And I'm told, a little bit similar to Missoula, it tends to be a liberal oasis surrounded by reality. I was actually in another town that reminds me a lot of Missoula and Madison a couple weeks ago. I was in the Netherlands, and I've never been to this town, but it's called Leiden. Leiden in the Netherlands, another university town, about 100,000 people, very similar. Of course, they're not a liberal oasis. They tend to fit in the Netherlands. The whole country is pretty liberal. But one thing that was quite interesting about Leiden is I learned about the importance of cross-cultural communication. So I was up at the podium starting my talk, and I said, Leiden reminds me a lot of my hometown, Madison, Wisconsin. There's a lot of quaint coffee shops, and the entire audience just bursts out laughing. And I'm like, I didn't think I was making a joke, but okay. And then someone actually comes to the podium and says, coffee shops are where you smoke marijuana. Okay, good to know. Note to self. So, it's important in our world, our small global village, to understand what words mean. And that's what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about a part of the world. In fact, not only a part of the world, but really Muslims, of course, are everywhere. They're right here in America. I'm one of them. And this community, this global religious community or faith community is often misunderstood or is often seen through the prism of sensational headlines. And ordinary people, like the people in this room, people all around the world, are very seldom heard from. And what my organization has been doing for 70 years, of course, is helping ordinary people be heard. So Dr. Gallup started our company with a very simple idea. He said that if democracy is about the will of the people, someone should go find out what that will is. He believed that leaders made better decisions when those decisions were informed by the will of the people. And so he started this organization built on just that simple concept, giving ordinary people a voice. And so that's what we tried to do. At Gallup, we went all over the world. In fact, we cover more than just these countries, but these are the specific nations that my research focuses on. And as you can see, we go way beyond the Middle East. We polled in more than 35 countries with significant Muslim populations, including countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in the former Soviet Union, Asia, Europe, as well as the Middle East. We also interviewed Muslims in Europe, as well as the United States. Our poll, when we talk about 1 billion people, a lot of times people say, well, there's no possible way you talk to 1 billion people. Well, you're right, we didn't. We didn't talk to 1 billion people. We talked to a sample representing 1 billion people. And here's how we did it. This is a map of Tanzania. And the red dots you see are what we call primary sampling units. What that simply means is areas or spots where our random methodology pinpointed a place where we were going to go down and find a household to interview a member of that household who's 15 years and older. And what you see from this map is how dispersed the dots are. We don't just focus our research on easy-to-get-to cities. Even in a country that is developing with a poor infrastructure like Tanzania, we go all over the country so that every single citizen has a chance to be heard. Our sample includes city as well as countryside residents, young and old, educated and illiterate, men and women, and people in rural as well as urban settings. We do all our interviews in-home and face-to-face, and this allows people who don't have access to the public space, who don't have access to a phone, the internet, and can't even read and write, to have a chance to be heard so that we're not excluding anyone. Our research covers 90% of the global Muslim population, making it the largest and most comprehensive study of contemporary Muslims ever done. But it's actually only a subset of a much wider study called the Gallup World Poll, where we cover 95% of the population of the globe in more than 140 countries. So we're looking at Muslims around the world, and it's just one of many topics we explore in our research within a global context, not simply as an isolated community. Another very important question to ask when you're looking at research of any kind, whether it's public opinion research, scientific research in terms of hard sciences, is who funded the research? It's a great question to ask. Our research is 100% self-funded. It is our investment in our R&D, and therefore we're independent. We are not beholden to anyone or any specific agenda. Gallup has established its business and its reputation on a fierce set of principles that are rooted in objectivity and being nonpartisan and non-political. And it's very important to be objective because on 9/11, 2001, our country was attacked. Shortly thereafter, Osama bin Laden came out with a statement praising the attacks, and his statement was laced with religious rhetoric. At the same time, we heard from other people who blamed Islam itself for the attacks, saying that it's time we admitted we are not at war with terrorism, we are at war with Islam, and that was Sam Harris writing in the Washington Times. So we've heard from people who blame the West for all the problems and others who blame Islam for all the problems. And yet the voices that we haven't heard from are the millions in the middle who tell us that they reject both extremes. With all that is at risk, with all that is at stake for the United States and the rest of the world, the time has urgently come to democratize the debate. And that's what this research is about, giving ordinary people a voice. And so let's start with some of the facts. We heard often that Muslims around the world who harbored anti-American sentiment hated us for our freedom. And so we asked this question, what do you admire most about the West? And here's what we heard. This is looking at Muslim populations around the world. The most frequent response was this: Western technology. And that doesn't just mean hardware, it means know-how, business know-how, the ability to apply knowledge to create progress. The second most frequent response was this: liberty and democracy. Now, we asked the American people the same question. What do you admire most about the West? We did specify Western civilization and not simply California. And here's what we heard: liberty and democracy and technology, number 2. Now, this is quite striking because this was an open-ended question. An infinite number of possible answers were available to people. And yet, to have this kind of common ground around the world is quite striking, that people essentially admire us for the same reasons we admire ourselves, that we're respected for what we ourselves hold dear. To give you a flavor of what people said in their own words, and these are ordinary people, these weren't necessarily professors or public intellectuals, ordinary people being interviewed in their homes. Here's what they told us in their own words. A Saudi respondent said, freedom of the press, opinion, and expression, also scientific advancement. In Iran, it was social justice and having access to nuclear power. Real democracy was what this respondent admired about the West. 2 respondents in Pakistan said this: the law's above all and everyone observes the law. And their political system is transparent and they are following democracy in its true sense. Finally, a Moroccan told us it was liberty and freedom and being open-minded with each other. What's interesting to note about these comments is that in their own words, people are describing the building blocks of a democracy. They might not use the word, but they seem to understand from their own words, concepts they are producing themselves, what a democracy essentially means. The ability to disagree peacefully, the ability to hold government accountable, and understand and have a line of sight into what governments are doing, transparency. We also found that direct questions like this, if we ask people if they were to draft a constitution for a new country, so a fully new country that you're going to get to create a new constitution for, what basic rights would you guarantee? We gave them some choices. Here's the percentage of people that said that they would guarantee the right of free speech, defined to them as the ability to say whatever one wanted about the economic, political, and social issues of the day. As you can see, strong majorities across the world said that they would include this fundamental right in a constitution if they were to draft their own. It's interesting to note that Egypt is within the margin of error, actually statistically identical to the United States, the American public, which is the last bar at 97%, whereas Egypt is at 94%. We also asked people what their dreams were for the future. And what we heard is that they want better jobs, not to fight a war, but to get better work, as well as better education for children. And again, this was a concept that was shared around the world. The most frequent responses, whether you were talking to someone in Birmingham or Baghdad, were around this amazing concept called a better job. Now, when it comes to Muslim women, many of the images that we've been bombarded with are ones that look like this. Women looking very submissive, socialized to accept a sort of second-class status. So in a survey of photographs of Muslims in the American press, this survey, this study found that 3/4 of the women were depicted in passive capacities compared to less than 1/6 of men. But how do Muslim women themselves see things? What is their point of view? We find that far from their image of submissiveness or passiveness, that Muslim women around the world believe that they should have a very active role in society. So majorities think, as just one example, that they should be able to work at any career for which they are qualified outside the home. Now, what you also see on this chart is the percentage of men in these countries who say the same thing. There's a number of things to notice. First, there's a diversity between different Muslim communities around the world. So, did I do something? Okay, I will try to be careful. In Lebanon and Malaysia, you have a near unanimous agreement, a consensus that yes, indeed, women should be out and can work at any job for which they are qualified. And then you go all the way to Iran and Egypt, where the majority of men and women say the same, but there's a bigger gender gap. So the takeaway is, throughout the world, even in conservative countries, the majorities of both men and women believe women should be active in the public space, but there is a diversity of views, there is a range, and in many countries, or at least in some countries, men or women are more likely to hold these views than are men, whereas in other countries, the gender gap doesn't exist. Now, all of this information might lead us to believe that Muslim women, as well as men, are eager to adopt Western culture. And that isn't the case. We found that they are interested in many of the rights enjoyed by women in the West, but want to lead their own progress within their own cultural framework. So we found that the most frequent response, the most frequent association women give us with the Muslim world is attachment to their spiritual and moral values is critical to their progress, whereas the statement they least associate with the Muslim world is this: adopting Western values will help their progress. But that should not lead us to believe that people are interested in isolation. Instead, Muslims around the world, as well as the American public, are mostly very interested in greater interaction. People want to engage with each other, but they also want to maintain their distinct identities. So here we find that people are more likely around the world to say that greater interaction is more a benefit than a threat. And it's interesting to note that the two countries that are most likely to say that greater interaction between the West and the Muslim world is a benefit versus a threat are the United States and Iran and Turkey. Now, this entire time we've been using clumsy words like the Muslim world and the West. Of course, these concepts are much more complicated, and essentially these words really are, don't describe what we're trying to convey, because the West is not seen as monolithic by Muslim communities. They are differentiating between different countries within what we call the West. So, for example, whereas the United States and Great Britain don't do very well on the favorability scale, according to the Egyptian public, France is actually viewed neutral to positive. And it's actually viewed slightly more positively than is a fellow Muslim majority country, that of Pakistan. And so people's views of countries are not falling along religious lines. Instead, they're falling along the perception of that country's policies toward their area of the world. If you look across the whole population, you find this, and this was in 2008, that 70% of Muslims associated the word ruthless with the United States. In contrast, only 8% associated that same word with France, and only 6% with Germany. Clearly, there isn't an issue with Western civilization as a whole, but instead specific countries based on perception of their policy. Thank you, Bob. The likely cause, or one of the issues that may contribute to this perception of ruthlessness is people's perception of the Iraq War, which majorities around the world said they felt did more harm than good. And that includes Iran, which we might expect to have been more positive toward the Iraq War, but even in Iran, 57% said they thought it did more harm than good. And that ranges all the way down to a whopping 94% of Egyptians. Another issue that is associated with negative views of the United States specifically, or a belief that it's controlling the region, is this idea of not truly allowing people in the region to fashion their own political future. The United States is sometimes viewed as a country that is interested or aggressively trying to manipulate or control the region. This is the perception that people have. So you find that this question, the US will allow people to fashion their own political future, majorities disagreeing, with some notable exceptions, of course. In Afghanistan, for example, a majority agree with this statement that yes, the United States will allow people to fashion their own political future. The third issue, if we say that the first is anger at acute conflicts, the second is the perception of political domination, the third is the perception of disrespect. This respondent captures what many, many people told us. In fact, it was one of the most dominant responses to the question of what the West could do to improve relations with the Muslim world. A Lebanese respondent said this: the West should treat Muslims equally to improve their relations because they look down upon us. There was over and over a sense from around the world that the United States viewed Muslims as inferior, that they weren't seen as being equal. And part of that is that there was this perceived gap between the admired values of democracy and human rights and how people believed they were being treated. And that gap between self-determination as a value and the belief that they were being denied self-determination was explained as Muslims were being singled out. Now, this concept of disrespect was one that we heard over and over during our research. So we decided to ask a direct question. Do you believe the Western world respects the Muslim world? And we asked this question around the world, not just of Muslim majority societies. Now, not surprising, you find majorities in countries like Egypt, the Palestinian territories, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, who say no, they don't believe the Western world respects the Muslim world. Now, what was surprising is that the American public actually agreed. The majority of Americans also say that they don't believe the Western world respects the Muslim world. So we looked at this a little bit more. And we asked this question: thinking very honestly about your feelings, how much prejudice, if any, do you feel toward each of the following religious groups? And we asked about several groups, but here we're just comparing how the American public feels about Jews and how they feel about Muslims. So 72% of Americans say that they have no prejudice against Jews, whereas the rest say they have at least some prejudice. Now, this shows us that despite the progress that we've made, anti-Semitism is still not a relic of the past. Now, here's what we found when it came to Muslims. 34% said they have no prejudice, whereas the remainder said they have at least some prejudice. 19% say they have a great deal of prejudice. We found that Muslims were among the most negatively viewed religious community in the United States, only doing better than atheists and Scientologists. So what we find here is this. This graph looks at the percentage of people who say they have negative views versus the percentage of people who have positive views of a number of religious communities. So here you have 58% of Americans say they have positive views of Jews versus 4% who say they have negative views, with a net of 54%. So that's how you can read that graph. For Muslims, it was a negative 4%, and that was, and that was in August of 2006. Now, when we tested this a little later, here's what we found. In 2006, we had a negative 4 as the net percentage of positive minus negative. In 2008, we tested again. Now, let's remember, between these 2 years, we didn't have another terrorist attack. The violence in Iraq had actually gotten better, partially because of the surge, but other things as well contributed. So we may have expected things to have gotten a little bit better. We're 2 years even later, beyond 9/11. We actually expected a slight improvement. But here's what we found. It was actually quite a bit worse, a negative 17. And what also happened during those 2 years was, of course, a presidential campaign, as well as soaring oil prices. This was the time, the era of $4, $4.50, at least in Washington where I was, a gallon, gas prices, which in many cases were thought to be related to dependence on foreign oil, which in many cases is related to the Middle East. It's hard to say why exactly there was a surge in negative opinion, but it did happen during this time period. Now, we looked at other research which I think is important to also look at, which is media content analysis. This is not research that Gallup does, but we looked at research done by a very reputable firm based in Germany called Media Tenor, and you can look on their website to understand more about their methodology. But what they do is they assign a value to every statement that's made on TV news media. So what they did is they actually looked at the percentage of negative, neutral, or positive statements that were made about Islam during the time period that we just looked at between 2006 and 2008, where there was such a surge in the negative opinion. What you find is that the majority of statements throughout this period about Islam on US TV news media are sharply negative. What they also found is that the protagonists, those who are speaking for religious communities, tend to be militants when it comes to Islam. So they found that 53% of the time, militants were representing Islam in the news media. In contrast, the majority of representations of Christianity were done by religious leaders, which of course makes sense. Now, many people might simply say, well, these acts of violence are happening. The news is simply reporting on them. And of course, that's true. They are happening. But if you look at the percentage of people who are actually carrying out those acts of violence, according to all estimates, they're actually in the thousands, not in the millions. They are a fraction of 1%. So they are clearly being overrepresented in the representation of this faith community. However, while we know empirically that the number of people carrying out violent acts is very small, what about their support base? How much public support do they enjoy? And I think that's an important question. Because if they might be small in number, if the majority of people actually sympathize or support them, then it perhaps wouldn't be very inaccurate to portray this community with this kind of a face, since they may support this. So we wanted to find out if that was true. by asking a number of questions. So here are 3 questions we asked Muslim communities around the world, and some of these were also asked of the American public. We asked, this was the full question item. There are many acts that some people may do in life. I will read out to you a number of these acts, and I would like you to indicate to which extent it can be morally justified. And here were some of the questions, some of the options. Sacrificing your life for what you believe in. And that you got a 5-point scale, 1 being cannot be justified at all, and they're anchored at 1 and 5, 5 being completely justified. The second one was the events of 9/11 in the USA. That is the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And finally, other attacks in which civilians are the targets. So the first thing we're going to look at is how people responded to the events of 9/11 question. Here were the responses. 55% said it was completely unjustified. 12% gave that item a 2, 11 a 3, 7 a 4, and then 7 told us it was completely justified, 5, and had unfavorable views of the United States. Now, what we wanted to do was to compare, to analyze, to understand what distinguished public support for terrorism from everyone else, from the mainstream. How do we define who those radical supporters are? So we did what is called a cluster analysis, where we graphed the 5 groups, depending on how they responded to the 9/11 question, on a graph based on their answers to the other 2 questions: sacrificing one's life for a cause one believes in, and targeting civilians is justified. And what we found is that those who answered 5 on the 9/11 question were distinctly different than the other 4 groups. And so through this process, we define the politically radicalized as those who responded with a 5 versus the rest. Now, what is different about these 2 groups, and what isn't different? Well, our first finding is the lack of a finding, actually. We found no statistical difference between the 2 groups in their level of reported religiosity. Both groups were equally likely to say religion was an important part of their daily life. I put this picture up because this beautiful woman, who looks like she walked off of perhaps a magazine cover, was one of the most anti-American respondents we talked to. And so it challenges some of our stereotypes of what people might look like in this community. Here we asked for people to explain their position on 9/11. We wanted them to tell us why they said what they did. And here's what we found. Those who condemned 9/11 said that they condemned it because of a moral objection to terrorism. Not surprising. They said that the loss of innocent life was something they were against. And many people rooted that moral objection in religion, in their religious belief, saying that murder was hated by God, sometimes actually quoting verses from the Quran that prohibit killing innocent people. In contrast, the politically radicalized, not a single one of those respondents told us it was a religious conviction that made them support the attacks of 9/11. Their responses were strikingly secular in nature, and related to their perception of politics. Not a single one of them quoted a verse from the Quran to justify their position on condoning or sympathizing with 9/11. But we also found, importantly, that attacks on civilians as a general tactic were rejected across the world. So whereas 6% of the American public say that attacking civilians or targeting civilians is completely justified, this compares to 4% of Saudi Arabians and 1 or 2% of Iranians and Lebanese, all within our margin of error. In fact, we found that Muslims around the world were even more likely than the general public in the United States to express concern about terrorism. So when we ask this question, what can the Muslim world do to improve relations with the West? Here's what we found. The most frequent response among Muslims was this: reduce extremism, be open-minded for the sake of progress, develop, progress, modernize Islamic culture. The control and stop extremism response was actually the second most frequent among Americans. So it was actually slightly more frequent among Muslim communities. We also found that when asked to express their greatest fear for their country, we found that Muslims around the world were more likely than the American public to say that they were afraid of being victims of terrorism. Now, this may be somewhat surprising, but if you look at all the facts, it's really not, because the numbers show that the primary victims of terrorist attacks around the world are actually Muslims. So the primary targets of terrorists in these areas, of course, are Muslims. And so it's not surprising that they would be even more concerned about terrorism than even the American public. To look at some of the other answers that people gave to this question about what the Muslim world can do to improve relations, they include these. The second most frequent among Muslims was to demonstrate more flexibility and to respect the West and their positive thinking. Third was to establish and promote relations based on mutual respect. And finally, to improve the presentation of Islam. So where people were asking for respect, they were also talking about that being a reciprocal process. Among the American public, here's what people said that they wanted the Muslim world to do to improve relations with them. First, to improve communication. Second, to control and stop extremism. To better understand each other's beliefs. And then finally, accept our way of doing things. In the end, though, it's important to take a longer view of this conflict, or of any conflict. We found that, for example, today, 90% of Christian and Muslim Lebanese have positive views of each other. Only a decade or two after a bloody civil war in Lebanon fought roughly along confessional lines. Today in the United States, we find that the majority of blacks and whites say the relationship between the two groups is good, about a generation, only a generation after the civil rights struggle. And whereas in 1958, only 4% of Americans said that they approve of marriage between blacks and whites, today that number is 80%. When the president, Barack Obama, was born, the marriage between his parents was actually illegal in Virginia, where I live. And we know that in 2008, he became the first Democratic presidential candidate to win Virginia in several decades. So all of this shows the possibility of groups, even ones that have been in conflict for centuries, of improving relations and the relative speed by which this is possible. So rather than allow a vocal fringe to monopolize the conversation about our global engagement, we should instead listen to ordinary people and thus let facts, not fear, shape our global engagement. Thank you. For more information, to download a discussion guide for the book Who Speaks for Islam, and for other articles and videos, please log on to MuslimWestFacts.com.
I'd like to open it up now to questions, please. We have no questions? Come now, people. Here we go. Thank you.
I think are people going to line up at the...
Okay, I was just told that we do have microphones on each side, so if somebody would like to go to either side of the stage here, we can take your questions. Unless you feel you can ask loud enough, I'll try to get to the rest of you.
There was a pie chart for a listing of numbers 1 through 5, where 5 was determining that would be, perfectly right to destroy civilians. But number 4 was also very strong, in my mind, for the destruction of civilians. Yet that was 45%. Any comments on that?
This one. Well, I don't have any comments. This is just the numbers we found, and they're sort of for everyone to come up with their own conclusion about. What I can explain is why we chose to focus on the 5s and not to include the 4s in our grouping of the politically radicalized. And the reason we didn't include the 4s is because of this chart. As you can see here, I don't know if I can. Well, what you find is that the 4s cluster with the 1s, 2s, and 3s when you look at how they respond to the other 2 questions. So it's a bit of an arbitrary decision as to where to split up the groups. We could also argue that anyone who doesn't answer a 1 should be included in the group that we analyze as being politically radicalized. But we allowed the data to drive that decision, to see where they broke up naturally. And here's, what we found. We found the 5s just looked very distinctly different and wanted to know what was different about them. But it's not a value judgment as to who really is or isn't problematic. It's more of an empirically driven analysis of a very distinct group and how they relate, how they differ from everyone else. And we found that those 5s were not different in their religious observation or their religious point of view, but rather they were really distinct in their political point of view.
Could you comment on whether or not she is reacting toward a more radicalized version of Islam, or is she bringing up some of the fundamental problems of, as she sees, the religious aspect of Islam?
Could you please also repeat that question maybe for people who may not have heard it back?
Sure.
Did everybody hear the question? Okay.
Maybe we should have people go to the mics. But I'll repeat this one. The question was about a book called Infidel by a woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and whether or not the book was her reacting to a radical version of Islam or her coming out with the actual problems with Islam itself. And I would respond in this way. I have read the book as well, that many of the things that she attributes to Islam are not Islam, and they are something else. They're about poverty, they're about tribal warfare, they're about cultural traditions that tend to be regressive. But she has assigned every problem in the societies that she's interacted with to the religion. The reason I say that many of these issues are not functions of the faith is because that's in fact what the data shows. So we did an analysis of sympathy for terrorism, and we found that it doesn't correlate with religiosity. In fact, those who condemn terrorism use religious justifications to condemn it, whereas those who condone it do not. We also looked at people who view women's rights either positively or negatively. So people who view women's rights as, or think that women should have equal rights with men, if anything, tend to be slightly more religious than those who are against women's rights. So her thesis that it's about Islam teaching regressive values is not supported in the data.
Other questions? In the back? We got somebody in the back with a question, please?
I have a question here. For those extremist Muslim groups that commit terrorism in the name of Islam, where are the moderate voices that are so prevalent, evidently, in the world that are trying to explain this is really not according to Islam? It seems that's quite quiet.
Well, I think your question is very important. The question is, I think, why aren't we hearing more moderates coming out and saying we don't agree with terrorism, or this act being done in our faith is not, doesn't represent us. And I think, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I can fully answer it, but a few things that I think are important to note, just in terms of factually, is that every single major religious leader in the world and every single Muslim religious organization in the world has issued clear condemnations of the attacks of 9/11. And these condemnations were issued on the day of 9/11/2001. I have a document at home that's at least 40 pages of just public condemnations from everyone from the Grand Mufti of Egypt to the Imam at the Grand Mosque in Mecca, to religious organizations headed, all kinds of people, every major organization. Now, How many people have ever heard of this happening? How many people were aware that this existed? Raise your hand. Okay. My expert estimation, it's probably 3%. And you guys are a very educated group. So there is condemnation happening, and it's not getting out there. Now these people have press conferences. All of these condemnations were done publicly, but it's not being covered. It's not getting out there through media. The other issue, though, I think is important to, I do think is important to think about is at what point will we assume that Muslims around the world don't agree with the actions of fanatics within their community? And I think it's an important question to ask, because if we think about it, when we hear about a crazy Christian fanatic doing something horrible, say someone in the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, the oldest terrorist organization in the world, uses Christian religious rhetoric, is a horrible ideological movement that is and was for a very long time violent. When we hear about a neo-Nazi or a KKK member doing something horrible, I think we think that's an aberration. That's a crazy person doing something horrible, and we don't expect every white Christian to condemn them. Otherwise, we assume they might agree. We sort of assume that they don't agree. And I think that some of that assumption of innocence also should be extended to Muslims around the world, especially since they are the primary victims of these acts of terrorism.
Over here, please.
Hey, just a quick question. I'm a little bit more of an optimist. I have a little bit more faith in my country, and I think we're trying to do improve our relations. For instance, Obama's speech in Egypt that he gave a few months back, dropping the war on terror, saying we're not at war with the Muslims. Do you think, and I'm not one to speculate, but do you think this would have any effect on a lot of the graphs that you presented, or were these all done after Obama's speech?
They were not done after Obama's speech. Our data after Obama will be coming out later this year, early next year. And all of these gestures have had a tremendous impact, actually. I had the pleasure of being in Cairo and attending Obama's speech and saw firsthand the impact it had. People were literally elated. He got a rock star reception in Egypt. And Egypt, as you saw in many of the graphs, is probably among the most negative, or was among the most negative populations. And he was interrupted 40 times by applause. Many times it was a standing ovation. He left to a standing ovation. The whole auditorium was chanting Obama as he walked out. I mean, he was an absolute rock star. Everyone was in love with him. And what he said really made people very, it really moved people. It really impacted people. And they felt like something really was changing and had changed. Now, he really, what he did, though, is he also elevated people's expectations. And so there's always this sort of window of opportunity that is created. But I mean, we've measured it, and I've seen it firsthand. The change in the approach has been noticed and very much appreciated by the audience.
I do have a question, but could you first go back to the slide? It's 1 or 2 clicks forward of the public approval of attacks on civilians. I wanted to get those numbers.
Sure, and it's also on our website.
Okay.
If you want to. It's sort of not working.
I'm sorry, I'm at the next slide over. The public approval of attacks on civilians in the U.S.
I'm
and various
sorry.
Muslim countries. Yes, that one, thank you. So I realize this requires you to make something of a generalization, but do you feel that U.S. policy towards Muslim nations and Muslims in general needs to be changed dramatically, changed slightly, changed at all? Can you just give me your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't have a position on our policy. I'm just here and going everywhere and writing books to report what we see on the ground. But at Gallup, we are very dedicated to not advocating for one policy or another.
All right, thank you.
Hello. So in April, I returned to the U.S. after 2 years of living in northern Mali with the Tuareg, a very conservative Islamic people. Mm-hmm. And after 2 years living in their culture, I feel strongly that the women there are as good as slaves. They don't choose their husbands. Sometimes they're married off at ages of 13, ready to bear family as soon as they start menstruating, and they're expected by law in Mali to obey every command of their husband. They're not permitted to worship in mosques, and they're not educated at all, let alone enough to read the very scripture that dictates their status under men. And what worries me is that I know that if I asked them about democracy, they would want democracy. They wouldn't want to see innocent victims of terrorist attacks, and they would like to see women doing the same things as men. Mm-hmm. But that will never happen for them, because the people who control them, the men that control them, don't have those views. And so as I investigated this, it seemed that what was said in the Quran, women were this way because of things that were said in the Quran. And so the more religious people are, it seems, the more they are convinced that women should be treated this way. And that's why just recently, when the president of Mali was approached with a bill, the Code de la Famille, to give women the same rights as their husbands, he denied the bill because of strong pressure from Islamic groups. And so my question is this the Islam you know, or is this a different version of Islam that these people have because of the way they interpret their Quran? Because if it is the same, how can women gain freedom, liberation, without there being a separation between church and state, which it seems like women in Muslim countries who are happy with Islam, it's because the state gives them enough freedom and liberation, perhaps not their religion.
Can we please give Dolly a chance to answer that, because we have time for about 2 more questions?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I think your question is an important one, and I am not an expert on Mali, so it's hard for me to comment specifically on the things that you just mentioned. What I will tell you, though, is that we have to look more broadly at countries around the world. And whereas that it might be the reality in Mali, in other parts of the world, women outnumber men at universities. Things aren't perfect, but things aren't quite as awful as what you're describing that you experienced in Mali, which I'm sure is the case. But there's a great deal of diversity throughout the Muslim community globally. Now, in regards to some of the issues that you mentioned being justified by the Quran, I think that this is also a very complicated issue that I don't want to get into in a lot of detail, but what I would encourage you to do is read some authoritative books on what the Quran actually says about women. And one thing I will say is, at the bare minimum, many of those things that you're describing are specifically prohibited in the Quran, and one of them being not getting to choose one's spouse. So I think a lot of times when you live in a religious society, just like when you live in a patriotic society, if you want to convince people of something, you will use the dominant social medium of that society, which in the case of Mali is going to be religion. So to gain control and power, you say everything is religion, and this is what religion teaches. These same women lack the education to read the very scripture that they're being told is the reason they're being oppressed. I think that's actually the root of the problem, is they don't know their rights. What is happening in many countries, and I can speak about Pakistan, Jordan, Egypt, and other countries, is that it's actually women reading their own scripture that are fighting for their rights using that scripture because they've gotten educated on it and know the rights that they in fact deserve according to the scripture. So there's an entire movement of women in the name of Islam fighting for greater rights.
Time for 2 more questions, please.
Thank you, Dahlia, for coming here tonight and helping to increase our understanding of Islam and to try to help bring more, I would say, peace into the world, understanding. I believe that Muslims and Christians and Jews, they all want basically the same thing as you have shown here. They value freedom and liberty and the good things of life. And what is your opinion about an outside force, particularly communists that are basically non-religious, having a hand in radicalizing this faction of Muslims to cause strife between the Christian world and the Jews, and to try to actually cause terrorism that would cause misunderstanding between the groups of people? And the communists, particularly the Soviet Union, these people, what do you believe their role is in this radicalizing the Muslim faction?
I don't know what their role is. It's really not my area of expertise to delve into what's going on inside terrorist organizations. I'm really just focused on public opinion and people's perception of those organizations.
Question, please. No, I have one more question, and we'll have to wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Maybe we can get a bonus question in. You had the slide up that indicated a broad spectrum of support for freedom of speech among Muslims. I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not you asked specifically about blasphemy laws that I hear a lot about across many countries, and how Muslims might feel about feel about them.
We did not ask specifically about blasphemy laws. It was just exactly as I had said, sort of a broad question of freedom of speech, the ability to say whatever one wishes about the political, social, and economic issues of the day. I suspect that the right to blasphemy would probably, and I'm speculating, but would probably have much less support than what we saw for the general concept of freedom of speech, which I think underscores a universal concept that in most societies, freedom of speech as a general concept is widely supported, but there are usually limits within each culture and society on what that freedom of speech means. Now, they're not the same, but there are laws against blasphemy in many European countries. You can't say it's an actual blasphemy law to say something negative about the Queen in the Netherlands, for example. It's actually against the law. So there are this concept, not to the same degree, not to the same sort of severity does exist in other parts of the world. So within many societies, freedom of speech as a general concept is supported, but people do have different ideas around what the limitations of that freedom is.
We're going to have time for one more question. Just want to remind people that Dolly will be available at the book signing right after the presentation. We do encourage people to become members of the council. We want to thank you very much for your participation here this evening. Last question, please.
Thank you. I was looking at the chart earlier, and it said that in America, below how people view religions negatively, below Muslims were atheists. And I know in this country, at least, from, say, the turn of the century in the 1900s to modern day, the number of atheists as a minority has grown. It's still a small minority, but it's definitely grown. And my question was, what percentage of the Muslim world, say, are atheists, and what's it like to be an atheist in the Muslim world?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to either one of those empirically. I don't know how many atheists there are in the Muslim world. It's just not a question that we are able to get a lot of answers to. And as an atheist in the Muslim world would be a small minority, that's clear in the data. And I'm sure it would be a difficult thing to be because you are surrounded by people who, while they may not practice their faith every day, do believe it's an important part of their life.
Dolly, can I answer this question?
Sure.
I think it's better to be an atheist in Muslim or our society than a Scientologist. Based on the data. Thank you very much for coming.